C-SPAN's Q&A.
Independent Alaska Governor Bill Walker suspended his campaign for re-election just days before this debate, throwing his support behind Democratic candidate and former U.S. Senator Mark Begich, who faced his Republican challenger Mike Dunleavy.
Alaska Public Media and Channel 2 News present Debate for the State, the gubernatorial candidates. Here are your moderators, Lori Townsend and Mike Ross.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Debate for the State. We're coming to you live from Alaska Public Media. I'm Lori Townsend.
And I'm Mike Ross. Tonight we're going to pose a series of questions to the two major candidates for governor, Republican Mike Dunleavy and Democrat Mark Begich, on some of the big issues facing our state, the state of Alaska.
In addition to Mike and I, reporters Andrew Kitchenman and Rich Maurer are here. We'll also feature video questions from the communities of Kotzebue and Utqiagvik.
Now, all of the questions and answers will be timed. The candidates also will be given the opportunity to ask questions of each other. Now, candidates will start with a 1-minute opening statement. The starting order was determined this evening by a coin toss. And Mr. Begich, please, your 1-minute opening statement.
Again, good evening, and thank you to KTUU and Alaska Media for this great opportunity, hopefully to share ideas about how we move Alaska forward. You know, this environment we live in today in the political world is toxic and negative, and I know we can do better than that. You know, I've been campaigning around the state, traveling, listening to Alaskans, and Alaskans know we can do better. But they're worried. They're worried about the state they love is slipping away. We have many challenges. If working together, we can solve these challenges. Together, we can reduce crime and make it a safer communities all across this state. Working together, we can make sure that our education system is better than it is today, giving opportunities for our young people. Working together, we can protect the PFD and make sure we have strong fiscal policy for years to come. The tough decisions have to be made to make sure we are planning for the future, not just tomorrow, but for 30 years out for generations to come. I look forward tonight to have a great discussion about the differences that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Begich. And Mr. Dunleavy, your 1-minute opening statement tonight.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mike Dunleavy, and I'm running for governor. On November 6th, you'll have a choice for the next 4 years. Who will lead Alaska? Where will that individual take Alaska? Will we have a PFD that is fully funded? Will we have a public safety approach that'll keep our streets safe from crime? Will we have better educational outcomes? Instead of being dead last in the country, can we move up in the ranks? Will we be able to put our resources to work so we can produce jobs, revenue, wealth for Alaskans? These are the choices that you'll be looking at in the next several days before the election. I hope to be your governor. I want to work hard to win your trust. Trust has been an issue in this campaign. For the past several years, we've had to look at what politicians say as opposed to what they do. Again, I'm Mike Dunleavy. I'm running for governor, and I would sure look forward for your support.
Thank you, Mr. Dunleavy. Our first question tonight is about transparency in government. Now, last week, Lieutenant Governor Byron Mallott resigned after making what the Walker administration described as inappropriate comments. Now, when he took office, Governor Bill Walker pledged transparency in his administration, yet he has so far refused to disclose specifics of what was said or the circumstances of the incident. Now, since the conduct of a statewide elected official was involved in this, does the public have the right to know what was said by Mr. Mallott? And if you had been in Bill Walker's shoes last week, what would you have done? Mr. Dunleavy, you're first.
That's a good question. As a public official, we're held to a higher scrutiny. And of course, there's questions as to what occurred. There's been statements made that folks are not actually talking about what happened to protect the victim. I understand that. And I hope that the victim is getting protection and is getting the help that they need. But this does not help with trust in our government. It does not help with transparency. And so hopefully in a short period of time, we'll understand, we'll know what exactly happened. But again, I do believe we need to protect the individual, the victim. But Alaskans should have an idea as to what occurred, because you did have a lieutenant governor that resigned, and shortly thereafter you had a governor that stepped aside from a race.
Mr. Begich, what's your response?
Well, it's a great question. And you know, again, you got to do whatever you can to protect the victim, no question about it. More disclosure, more transparency is important in these situations, especially when you are dealing with a public official. But talking about the issue of transparency is a great question, because I hear all the time how it doesn't disclose enough issues, put enough information out there. You know, all the times I've served in office, I made sure, for example, we put everything on the table. When people called and asked a question, we didn't hide information, we put it out there. We got to create more trust for our people in this state. You know, they have a distrust of the legislative process, what's going on. A lot of deals are being made behind closed doors. They want to see more of that in front of them. They want to make sure they have a voice and a part of the process. So transparency in a broader spectrum, we need to put more of it in our government.
As we said, during tonight's debate, we will have occasional questions from Alaskans around the state. Here's Dan Croson in Utqiagvik.
Future governors, we want to know what you're going to do with the permanent fund.
It's the question that's been on everyone's mind. We've got a few specifics. This year's permanent fund dividend was set at $1,600 by the legislature. Lawmakers use proceeds from the permanent fund to help balance the state budget under the previous calculation method. The PFD this year would have been close to $3,000 per Alaskan. Where do you stand on this? How should we set the amount of the PFD? Mr. Begich.
Well, first off, the PFD, the permanent fund dividend, is important. You know, the action that the legislature took over the last 3 years put an impact on working families disproportionately to try to solve this budget. It was an unfair way to deal with it. But how would I do it? Right now, the corpus of the fund and its retained earnings have about $65 billion. The earnings reserve has about $18 billion in it right now, which the legislature can access with a simple vote and majority vote. What I would do is put a big chunk of that into the corpus, keep it away from these politicians. The next thing I would do is a percent of market value, making sure we have a formula. So 50%, as that formula lays out, would go right into the permanent fund dividend and constitutionally protected. The only one in this race that has talked about constitutionally protecting it, keeping it in your hands. The value of that would be around $2,100 this year. If you leave it where it is today, it will be in the hands of politicians, and they'll debate this issue off and on, and your dividend over time will disappear.
Mr. Dunleavy?
Thank you. I fought hard to protect the PFD. The PFD has been an institution in Alaska for almost 40 years. The permanent fund was established in the late 70s by the people of Alaska to save wealth from that period of time for future generations, and the PFD program came in shortly thereafter. It's worked beautifully. The PFD was never the problem. The problem has been overspending by state government over the years. You will have a full PFD under my administration. I fought hard. I voted against SB 128, which was the first attempt to change the PFD. I voted against SB 26, which was another attempt to change the PFD. I submitted bills, SB 1, to return the full PFD. The calculation, the current calculation that's on the books, that's been on books for years, is the calculation that I will use. And I can assure Alaskans that one of the first orders of business when I get into government, into the governorship, is going to be to return the full PFD to the people of Alaska.
Gentlemen, we touched on this, but we do want to reiterate, because we hear this from our viewers a lot. Do you support the concept of a PFD mandate in the Constitution? How would you structure the permanent fund dividend to make sure the legislature doesn't raid the money to support government spending in years when we have low oil prices? And what should the split be for proceeds from the permanent fund going to state government, going to the people of Alaska? Mr. Dunleavy.
I think it should be a 50-50 approach, like it has been for decades. The people of Alaska never complained about the size of the PFD when it was subject to the calculation that's been on the books forever. If it was $700 a year, people didn't complain. If it was $900 a year, people didn't complain. People started to get agitated when the governor vetoed the portion of the PFD. And the reason they did that was because they felt that government was sticking their hands in a system that actually worked well. Going forward, we may need to have discussions as to what this is going to look like, but it must involve the people of Alaska. We want to take a look at whether this thing, in fact, this PFD and the permanent fund needs to have a POMV approach. But we have to have a discussion with the people of Alaska, and certainly they need to be involved in any changes to the PFD program or the permanent fund.
Mr. Begich, you've already told us this evening you support a constitutional mandate. How do you keep the legislature from raiding the proceeds from the permanent fund? We have these low oil years.
Well, Mike, your question is a great question, because what has happened, first the Constitutional Budget Reserve, which had $16 billion. 80% of it is now gone because legislators took that money. Now, the way you solve this problem, I believe, you got to put the PFD into the Constitution. The earnings reserve, which is a critical part of this, again, the legislators have access to this. You got to take that off the table, put it into the corpus. If you put it into the corpus, then the politicians cannot touch it. The other idea is you got to make sure it's sustainable. The idea that I've laid out is 50% going to the permanent fund dividend, constitutionally protected, voted on by the people, keep it out of the hands of politicians. I've not heard Mike say that. He talks about an advisory vote, which means It goes back to the hands of politicians. No disrespect to them. I don't have a lot of faith that they'll do the right thing over the long term. We need to protect this. The other half I've suggested to go into education funding and constitutionally protect the education funding over the long haul.
Mr. Dunleavy, do you have a rebuttal?
I do. I favor a vote going to the people, either an advisory vote and or constitutional amendment. In State Affairs, in which I was the chair, I moved 2 bills out of State Affairs that would have constitutionalized the permanent fund. I think it does need to be protected. My point in what I was referencing earlier was it worked well for years until government put its fingers in it, but I think it's time that we have a discussion on what this fund and what the PFD is going to look like going forward, and I think that people need to be involved.
All right, I think we have an interjection from our panel.
Yes, follow up by Rich Mauer.
I guess this is for both of you. As far as putting the dividend into the Constitution, I think you mentioned the Constitutional Budget Reserve. That's in the Constitution too, and yet you say the legislature raided it. How do you protect the
There's a difference here,
Mr.
Rich. And so let me, I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. Begich,
go ahead,
please.
Okay. He was looking at me, so I
Yes.
wanted to answer it. But first, I want to say one thing about Mike's plan. His plan leaves a $1.6 billion hole in the budget. You cannot fund what he's suggesting in the long term. People will lose their dividend in the long term. The Constitution, how you write the constitutional protection is you put it into the Constitution. You make sure the wording is protecting the dividend for the residents of this state. 50% of it through the percent of market value. It's a formula that you put into the Constitution. The Constitutional Budget Reserve does not create a formula. It's just a fund that they put money into.
We'll have to leave it there.
And quick
Mr.
rebuttal from
Dunleavy.
Mr. Dunleavy so we can move on to some other topics,
Yes.
if you have one, sir.
We need to engage the people of Alaska. They're the ones that actually created this fund back in the late 70s. And they need to be part of what this looks like. Again, the PFD, although it was approved by the legislature, it's become an institution for the state of Alaska, for Alaskans. And so we need to engage them in both, I think, an advisory vote and a constitutional amendment to make sure that that fund stays intact for future generations.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. And
Andrew?
one more question from Andrew
Kitchenman
from Alaska Public Media.
Question for both of you. Mr. Begich, your plan would cost $340 million more for the PFD that's going to state government services this year. Mr. Dunleavy, your plan would cost roughly $880 million more that's going to government services this year to pay for the PFD. How would each of you make up for that cost?
Well,
Yes.
I think the whole plan, the fiscal plan, is what you have to look at. As I suggested, you got to get the permanent fund dividend resolved. Also, I would suggest putting 50% constitutionally protecting education, making sure that comes out of the general fund. This next thing you need to do is make sure government runs as efficiently as possible. There's huge opportunities. And third, at the end of the day, no matter what fiscal plan you have, under Mike's or mine, you're going to have a revenue source that solves this problem long term for Alaska.
All right, and Mr. Dunleavy, one more response.
We need to manage our government better. You can't pick up the paper almost on a daily basis without seeing something happening with API. We have Medicaid overture spending. We have a whole host of issues in terms of management issues in our government. I believe that if we manage our programs better, we can save millions of dollars. Shrink the size of government, push those costs down, and then when we get to the point where we have managed the government well, the people of Alaska, through transparency and budgeting, see that we're managing the government well, then we can have a discussion as to what revenue sources we need looking forward. But until that point, I don't think the people of Alaska are ready to look at a tax or a permanent fund take.
And let's talk about the budget, gentlemen. Our next topic is the state budget picture, which has been a major source of debate the past few years since oil prices dropped. Oil prices are up, but we know they could go down again. What would you do to stabilize the state's budget situation? New revenues like an income tax or a state sales tax? Or would you go with new cuts to state services? And please be specific in your answers. Mr. Begich, we'll start with you.
Well, I think there's a couple things you can do. I've talked about how you can do some reforms on Medicaid, the $800 million piece of the puzzle. I support Medicaid. I think it's an important part for our working families. But I do believe through some innovative approaches, 30% of the cost of Medicaid is paperwork, moving paper back and forth. I think there's significant opportunity there. But at the end of the day, I know my opponent talks about trust. You have to be honest with the people. We're going to have a broad-based, some sort of revenue stream to ensure that we have longevity. You cannot just bank on the high price of oil. You cannot hope today it's 78 and balance it out. That's why we're in this problem. We need to have a balanced approach. Maybe today it's at $63 a barrel for our budget. Maybe you put it at 65, whatever goes above that, you put aside back into the constitutional budget reserve to protect for really downside, or put it into one-time expenditures. But if you just plan it for the high price of oil, we will be in this problem and the next generations will pay the price. And that is not acceptable to me.
Mr. Begich, again, the question was, do you income tax, sales tax?
I think there's a variety of revenue sources. Income tax, sales tax, we have to figure out how to get 21 House members, 11 senators to vote for it. I'm open to the options. But I will say this, over $2 billion from outside workers that come up to our state, use our services, don't pay anything, but we pay the bill for them. We need to have a revenue stream that ensures we capture those folks so they pay for some of the services.
All right,
here.
thank you, Mr. Begich. Mr. Dunleavy, your response to this
When
question.
folks talk about taxes, they don't go into details. What kind of tax? How large of a tax? What percent? Who gets exempted? How long does it go on for? What does it really collect? And what are the behaviors that a tax will do? We don't have those discussions. We just talk about a tax almost as if it's of some type of a magical instrument that if you just put a tax in the books, everything will be fine. You still have to manage the government better. In the 80s, the people of Alaska put into the Constitution an appropriation limit to try and ramp down and confine the legislature's ability to spend grow an operating budget. I think we need to revisit that amendment. I think we need to ramp that amendment down somewhere to around $4 billion and allow that to grow at about 2% a year. Once you do that, then you start to you have to manage your programs better. Before you even talk about taking the PFD or tax, you need to put those instruments in place, because if you don't, your government will continue to grow out of control and will be going to the people of Alaska year after year for more taxes or more permanent fund take.
But again, in terms of specifics,
Sure.
name one thing that you would cut from the budget.
$4.5 million fast rail study from Matsu to Anchorage, I would eliminate that. I would look at eliminating climatologists. We have over 2,000 funded but unfilled positions in state government. I would look at those positions to see what positions and what funding we can move to other parts of government to reduce the size of government.
All right, now we're going to be giving the candidates a chance to ask their opponent a question. The format will be a 30-second question, a 1-minute answer, and a 30-second rebuttal. Mr. Dunleavy, your question to Mr. Begich, please.
Sure. Mark, you keep criticizing my approach to managing government, yet you have made it clear you support new taxes on Alaskans, but have offered absolutely no specifics. So Alaskans deserve to know, how much can the average Alaskan family expect to pay in new taxes on your plan? What kind of taxes? If it's an income tax, what percentage will you aim for? What will your new Alaska IRS look like? Who's exempt? Please give Alaskans some specifics on your tax plan.
Mr. Begich.
First off, Mike, I don't have a specific tax plan. What I have said over and over again, that we have to solve this problem for the long term. We have issues that have been debated for years about a fiscal plan. We are at the point. 80% of the savings of the Constitution Budget Reserve is gone. We know we have to deal with the permanent fund dividend. We know we have to deal with more efficiency in government. But at the end of the day, no matter what you put on it, Mike, we're going to have to deal with some revenue stream to solve this problem. And I will be very frank with you. I've managed an operation of 3,000 employees, the city of Anchorage. We grew it with a balanced budget, made sure we had the public safety that was needed, made sure we grew the city. 40% of our new revenues came from new development because we invested. This is how you manage a large operation. Utilizing those experience in the state will be an incredible opportunity, I believe, to give a new renaissance for our state. Instead of where it is now, high unemployment, high crime, not great education in the sense of where we are compared to other states.
You have 30 seconds for
Sure.
rebuttal.
Mark, at the forum we had yesterday, you said yes to a sales tax and an income tax. So the question is, what percentage, how large of a tax, who would be exempt?
Do I get the...
Oh, certainly, Mr. Begich, go ahead.
Great. They asked the concepts. I've told you 100 times, Mike, or less than that, because you haven't shown up at all the debates, but I will tell you very frankly, again, that is a conversation of what revenue streams will we have. Will it be a mix? Will it not be a mix? We have to figure this out long term. It's the same question I would ask you over and over again. You mentioned 3 or 4 things, but your proposal, you just said, would have to cut the state budget $600 million based on today's budget. You gave about $3-4 million worth of cuts. Where are you going to solve that problem?
All right, let's leave it there. And Mr. Begich, now you may ask a question of Mr. Dunleavy. You have 30 seconds. Mr. Dunleavy, you'll have 1 minute to answer, and then you'll have a 30-second rebuttal if you'd like it.
Mike, Alaskans are struggling with a rising crime rate, some of the highest in the country. As I mentioned, number one, you've been campaigning over and over again, telling Alaskans you want to make sure we're safe. But when asked specifically recently, what are your details of your crime plan, you said, I'll get to it I'm too busy painting. Don't you think Alaskans deserve to know more details? Do you regret that statement that you made about maybe after the election you'll give the details on a crime plan?
Mark, I've been specific in all of our debates, all of our forums, when I'm campaigning on the radio. We have to get the right number of troopers in place. We have to get the right number of prosecuting attorneys to move our cases through. We have to open up the courts Friday afternoon instead of closing it Friday afternoon. And we have to look at corrections to make sure that we have the right number of folks there, because there will be a bit of an increase in folks going to prison. Again, the question is going to be, how do you pay for this? We have 2,000 positions that were funded but not filled. We have efficiencies that we all know we can make in our various programs. We'll shift some of that money into public safety. Public safety will be one of the first, it will be the first budget items that I fund as governor, because it needs to be priority number one.
Mike, your record is a different ballgame. You know, when you were in the Senate multiple times, you cut the prosecutors, you cut the attorney's office, the court system, the troopers, the treatment programs, all the things you just talked about that you want to put back in, you cut them all. And you wonder why we're #1 in crime? So you don't get it both ways. You got to be for it or you got to be against it. And right now, I know you're running for office, and now you have a whole new plan that's made up on the cuts you just made in your term in the Senate.
Quick rebuttal to the rebuttal.
Yes.
So the troopers and the Public Safety Employees Association endorsed me 2 weeks ago, Mark, because they believe that my plan is going to make Alaska safer. When I was in the Senate, I actually put forth a $50 million amendment that would move money out of AGDC into $10 million into public safety. It was approved by all of the individuals in the Senate. It was a 20-0 vote, died over in the House. I do have a plan, and I am going to make public safety my #1 priority as governor.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another major topic tonight, education. And we're going to, last April, Alaska's 4th and 8th grade students again scored below national averages on reading and math in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Now, Alaska 4th graders last year scored the lowest in the entire country. Gentlemen, is this a sign that we are failing our children and we need to spend more on education? Or is it a sign that Alaska taxpayers are not getting their money's worth for what they've already paid for public education in Alaska? Mr. Dunleavy.
Sure, I've been an educator my entire career. Spent 19 years out in rural Alaska. Alaska's always been concerned about inputs, meaning the government. How much money do we get to put into something? But really, we've really failed across the board on demanding outcomes. When I'm governor, I'll make sure that all 4th graders can read by the time they leave, 3rd graders by the time they leave 3rd grade and go into 4th grade. They're going to be able to read at grade level, because that is a gatekeeper skill for any other course, any other endeavor they're going to pursue. I would also make sure that by 8th grade, 9th grade at the latest, all of our kids are proficient in algebra. That too is a gatekeeper course. And I would make sure that our career education, our career tech in high school is also one of quality that has outcomes. But each of these approaches have to demand the outcomes. We have to have reading specialists that are trained up. We have to make sure that from the governor on down, we expect that these outcomes in reading, proficiency in algebra, and career tech are there. How do we do that? Again, we have to reallocate resources to make sure that we're focused on those 3 core areas. If we do that, you're going to see our scores go up, and you're going to see kids have more of an opportunity.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Mr. Begich, your response.
Well, as I said earlier about the permanent fund dividend, 50% of the funding source that we would make sure that education is fully funded in the Constitution. This has been the problem. The legislature every single year puts it on the chopping block at the end of the year. Teachers aren't sure if they're going to get a pink slip or not. Parents aren't sure if their favorite teacher is going to be back because of the budget cuts. The idea here is to make sure it's constitutionally protected, but also adding in pre-K. The best investment we can make is for pre-K. 90% of the brain development occurs for kids between 0 and 5. This is an investment we cannot forget about, and I want to make sure that's funded. But also we need to grow our own. You know, only about 20-some% of our educators are from Alaska. Our university system has started a program. We want to expand that to make sure we are educating or putting into place people from Alaska to work in our education system. And we need to make sure it is expanded, to make sure we have opportunities for young people, not only go on to 2- and 4-year colleges, but vocational ed, internship programs, all the types of things that we need in this economy more than ever.
All right, looking overall at K through 12 education, do you support using public dollars to provide school choice vouchers for private schools? Mr. Begich.
No, I do not. I think the public education system is an important part. My parents were teachers. My sisters were teachers, my sister-in-laws are teachers, and I'm going to tell you, it's the best investment you can make, because at the end of the day, it gives everybody, no matter who you are, where you are, what your income is, and an opportunity to have a free education to advance your life in any way you see fit. I think it's an important investment. I know I differ with my opponent on this. This is public money for public education. But we need to make sure, as I said just before, to make sure it's high quality, making sure our kids have the best opportunities. Along with that, we need to make sure our higher education is re-engineered or rethought about how it can match our economy that's growing today. Making sure that if you want to be a nurse today, you're not waiting 2 years to get into a program, because every person that comes out of that gets a job. One of the fastest growing industries is healthcare. So I don't support a voucher. I think it's the wrong thing to do. And can you imagine in rural Alaska if that's all you had was a voucher and you only have one school? It doesn't make sense. It's wrong.
Mr. Dunleavy.
Yeah, and I'm not going to take a shot at Mark, but my family, my entire family history is nothing but public education. We have not sent any of our kids to private education. Mark has, and I don't blame him, because as a parent, you want to have the best possible education for your child. So what I want for all Alaskan children is the best possible education. And I believe that public school choice first is important, meaning we have a situation in Alaska right now that we have public monies going to private education as part of the vendor process for public homeschools. We have private individuals that get paid through the allotment process to help educate kids in our public schools. We already have this process going on. What started this conversation several years ago is I ran a bill called SGR 9, which would make it legitimate to do that in face of the Sheldon Jackson case of 1976. So right now we're a little out of whack with the Constitution, but my goal is to make sure that we have the best public educational program for all kids, but I want to make sure that we have private-public partnerships so that we can make this the best public education system.
All right, thank you. Healthcare is on the list of questions Alaskans wanted to ask about.
My name is Barbara Collison, and I live in Kotzebue. And I'm wondering whether you would be considering cutting the funding for Medicare and Medicaid if you're elected governor.
So I'll paraphrase for you. I'm sorry that you could not hear that question. Her question was whether you would be considering cutting the funding for Medicare and Medicaid if you're elected governor. And of course, governors cannot affect the cost of Medicare, but you can affect Medicaid. Would you repeal the Medicaid expansion? And if so, how would the 44,000 people who have received coverage under it access health care? Mr. Dunleavy, your answer first.
My first order of business would be to assess the status of our Medicaid program. In other words, the management issues again. We have reports that we've overpaid providers by anywhere from $78 to $160 million that we're going to have to claw back or receive penalties from the federal government. So the first thing I'd want to do is make sure that those programs are being run well. I have no intention of kicking people off of health care. I think all Alaskans should have access to good quality health care. But once again, we need to manage these programs well. We need to take a look at how these programs are actually being implemented. You read the paper, you see news clippings, news articles of fraud in Alaska. Our behavioral health approach is falling apart because of mismanagement in Alaska. We need to manage these programs better, but I don't have any intention of kicking people off of our health care programs.
All right, Mr. Begich.
I just heard, Mike, your response. You didn't support Governor Walker when he put it on and put 44,000 people onto Medicaid. He had to do it by executive order because members like you and others in the legislature wouldn't support it. So, and I know on this debate you've had different views on this, but no, I think Medicaid is an important part of making sure health care is available for Alaskans. There's a lot of working families that depend on that to make sure they have the health care they need to ensure that they can go to work or go to school or whatever they're doing to make their life more productive. And the Medicaid program has been very successful, but we can improve it. For example, there's not a good preventive health care within the Medicaid system. If you could save 5% just on better preventive health care, you'll save almost $40 million out of the program. I also think there's another way of streamlining that paperwork. 30% of the cost, $240 million, is in paperwork alone. I think there's ways to shave 10 to 15% of that, making sure we have better dollars being spent to ensure we have quality care. But it's an important part. It has provided an incredible amount of jobs and $1 billion of federal dollars into our state providing new opportunities for our healthcare systems.
All right, thank you. We'll have to leave it there.
Gentlemen, we want to cover a wide variety of topics. One of them, the topic of climate change. Now, researchers have said that the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as other places in the world. As a state whose economy is reliant on fossil fuels, how do you balance that with the need to reduce carbon emissions? And let's go to Mr. Begich first.
Well, I think it is a balance. You know, I supported helping open up the Arctic for oil and gas drilling, NPRA, and or I supported. At the same time, for example, when I was mayor, we got very aggressive. We had the largest light conversion project in the nation, converting our street lights to more efficient lights, saving, lessening the emissions, but saving $400,000 a year. A project now that we have out at the landfill. It used to be we'd burn off the methane gas. Now it's recaptured, sold to the military, cheaper than you can buy natural gas. I think Alaska has some incredible opportunities when you look around between wind and tidal and geothermal, all the opportunities to lower our emissions in our state. We have a goal by 2025 to be 50% renewable energy. I believe we can get there. I was just in Kodiak and it was an amazing 99% of their energy sources are renewable energy, not putting emissions into the air. That's how we have to do it. It's a balanced approach. Do our part, but at the same time recognize who we are as a state.
Mr. Dunleavy, what's your response?
So we are a resource state, and I do support our oil, gas, and our coal industries. It brings jobs, it brings wealth, and it brings revenue to Alaska. We, you know, we have to make sure that we have a balance, as was said. We can't throw people out of work by shutting down some of these industries. Alaska is not really a smokestack state. Our contribution to climate change is probably minimal. So I think what we need to really focus on is making sure that we have Alaskans going to work. We make sure that we use technology when we can to reduce emissions. But in the long haul, Alaska's contribution to climate change, once again, is minimal.
Rich Mauer has a follow-up.
I would like to ask both candidates, because I think you both said that we've got to develop fossil fuel resources. You say that, Mr. Dunleavy, you say that that we can't afford to be the leader. We're negligible, but I mean, so is Brazil, and so are other countries, and we're asking them to join in taking steps to abate climate change. How could Alaska not, with its fossil fuel development, how could we not participate in this as well?
I beg to differ. Brazil has millions and millions and millions of people, and they do have many, many factories emitting emissions into the air. Alaska has 730,000 people. Our industries are resource-based, resource extraction. We extract oil, we extract coal, we extract gas. That's what we do in Alaska. That's where we get most of our revenue, that's where we create most of our wealth. So I disagree. We're not like Brazil, we're not like China, we're not like other states down the lower 48. Our contribution is negligible.
Well, you know, we all have to do our part, and I think we can have a careful balance as I laid out. For example, when you think the impacts, we're ground zero when it comes to climate change. You know, when you see acidification of the waters and warming of waters that are impacting our fisheries, when you look at what's happening to the spruce bark beetle and the impacts to our forestry, all of this and many more things are impacting us. We can do our part. If we can meet our goal of 50% by 2025, it will be a contribution to this broader spectrum. And plus, it's good business. People are now building solar opportunities, building wind turbines, employing Alaskans. There's a great opportunity to take advantage of this and be a much more efficient state.
We'll have to leave it there. Let's move on to other voter choices. Along with deciding which one of you will be the next governor, Alaskans will also be voting on another big issue, Ballot Measure 1. Supporters say it would protect vital salmon habitat. Opponents argue it would bring resource development and construction projects to a halt. How are you going to vote on Ballot Measure 1? And if elected governor, how would you balance protecting Alaskan salmon resources with industry and development? Mr. Begich.
Well, I'm voting yes on one, but I also believe in the 45,000 people that decided to get out there and put an initiative together and put it on the ballot. I believe in public comment, an opportunity for people to have an opportunity to tell the public, and tell, in our case, the government what they think is wrong when there's a permit being issued. One of the few that doesn't allow public comment on. But put that aside, your question on the larger thing, how do you balance these things? What I've done all my life, example I gave earlier about the Arctic drilling and working on the NPRA to make sure it is opened and available, which is now putting oil in our pipeline, You have to balance it carefully, working with all sides, bringing all stakeholders together. This is an important part of the politics of today. You know, it's so toxic, as I mentioned in my opening. We have to bring it back, bring people together. I don't care if they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, develop, environmentalists, figuring out this together. Because if we don't do this right at the end of the day, it will harm us economically long term. It's why I didn't support out in Bristol Bay when they wanted to do drilling out there many years ago, and also Pebble Mine. But I also support other mines. It's a balanced approach based on the conditions around them and bringing stakeholders together.
All right, Mr. Dunleavy.
Thank you. I'm a no. I'm a no on one. I think it's overkill. I believe it'll shut down a lot of projects in the state of Alaska, and I'm not just talking about oil or gas or coal, but hydro projects, also municipal water and sewer projects, potential road projects. And the problem with this is it's going to constrain our ability to develop our state, which translates into less jobs, more folks on some of our social service programs. It'll be problematic for Alaska going forward. It'll cause investors to shy away from Alaska. I just think it's overkill. It's too broad. I think we could deal with some of these issues if we need to, but I think it's bad for Alaska.
All right, thank you.
All right, Andrew Kitcheman has a question.
For both candidates, beyond ballot measure 1, salmon runs have been declining in some parts of the state. There are different interests, commercial, sport, subsistence. What would you prioritize in managing Alaska's fisheries?
Mr. Begich.
Well, I think all of them are part of the process. When I served in the Senate chairing the Oceans Committee, we dealt with all three of those in the sense of sports fishermen, the subsistence users, and commercial fishermen. For the first time, we brought those other two, sports and subsistence, into the process of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which they were not. But I think it's a balanced approach. They're all important to our economy in different ways, but subsistence is very important to rural Alaska, because without their ability to catch their fish, they cannot feed their family, and that's an important priority for me.
Mr. Dunleavy.
Thank
Yes.
you. Feeding one's family is the most important use of our fishing game. The Constitution calls us for managing for abundance and maximum use for our citizens. With that said, we have to bring all the users together to make sure that we come up with an approach that's going to grow the resource so we can have consistent, robust runs of salmon throughout the state. Working together with subsistence users, sports fishermen, commercial fishermen, I think we can lay out a plan to get us there, but certainly in times of shortage, putting food on the plate is job number one.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. You both touched on this topic earlier. We're talking about crime. It has Alaskans very worried. The increase in crime across the state. Beyond calling for more troopers and other officers, what would you specifically do as governor to rein in crime related to drugs and addiction? Let's start with Mr. Dunleavy.
I would increase the penalties on those that are dealing drugs in the state of Alaska. I'd be pretty harsh with those individuals if they're going to come to the state of Alaska and deal death to our citizens. This opiate crisis is out of control. I'd work with the federal government on interdiction. We have a coastline that's bigger than the rest of the lower 48 put together. I'd work with the federal government on potentially prosecuting some of these individuals because they have stiffer penalties at this point. Looking at the enforcement side, we need to get tougher on these folks that are dealing death. We also need to make sure that we do have programs that help folks get off of this addiction if they truly want to get off of it. And we have to make sure that those programs are research-based and actually work. But there'd be at least two approaches that I would use to deal with the opiate issue.
Mr. Begich, crime related to drugs and addiction.
You bet. I mean, it's definitely a major problem. It's number one issue I hear when I'm out throughout Alaska traveling and listening to what Alaskans care about. A couple things you can do. First off, and I had to deal with this when I was mayor of Anchorage, you do have to still fill the trooper positions, the corrections officers, but you can go couple step further. For example, like I did when I was mayor of Anchorage, I hired 2 prosecutors to work directly in the federal prosecution office with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Why? Because when you deal with drug dealers through that process, they get 10 years mandatory, shipped out of state and onto some federal penitentiary with no probation. You can also work with the postal system to make sure we bring in troopers with sniffing drugs. An enormous amount of drugs can move through our postal system, and they don't have the resources, so we will add our resources to make sure. You can move 30–40% less drugs through the system if you have the right kind of enforcement. But we also have to deal with the addiction issue. 80% of our folks in corrections need the treatment necessary, those that want to have it. Wellness courts are another great investment. I've seen the turnaround. 90% of the people who go through wellness courts do not reoffend. It's the right kind of investment to have a long-term impact.
Andrew has a follow-up. Andrew Kitcheman.
Medicaid funds a lot of behavioral health and addiction treatment. It's an optional service. will you commit to maintaining this service, for both of you?
Mr. Begich.
Mr. Begich.
Yes, but I would do a couple more quick things. You know, if you are let out of prison, and let's say you're dealing with a drug treatment program within prison, the drug that you're utilizing lasts about 28 days, but you got to reapply or get on Medicaid 30 days later. Both these programs are run by the state. You think we can fix this because you don't want that person after 28 days come off a high. I've seen it. And if they get off their high, they're going to go right back in and out on the street. We need to make sure their treatments continue. Medicaid is part of that equation, so I would make sure they are taken care of on Medicaid on
We'll
the
have
way
to leave
out.
it there.
Mr.
Dunleavy.
The question, please repeat it.
Medicaid funds behavioral health treatment, including addiction treatment. It's an optional service. Would you commit to maintaining this service?
We continue to take a look at that program to make sure it's being implemented and managed correctly to help the individuals that are utilizing that program. So once again, I have no intention at this time of eliminating any of these programs, but managing them better.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. And we do want to ask on the crime topic, SB 91, it is a hot topic. Do you repeal it completely? Do you fix it? Mr. Dunleavy.
I would repeal it. A lot of the fixes have already been moved into SB 54, which was a companion bill, a subsequent bill to 91. But I would repeal it because the people of Alaska have lost trust in this bill. And I believe that we could do better. I believe that we can fill in the holes that are in 91 and, again, restore that trust with the people of Alaska.
Mr. Begich.
It's amazing on this issue of SB 91, people who passed it. I know Mike Dunleavy worked in committee, came out of one of his committees he was on. He was for it, now he's against it. I get it. But here's the issue with SB 91. You do have to clear the deck. It's a bigger issue than just that. As I mentioned earlier, you got to put more public safety on the street, deal with corrections, and give them the resources they need. You have to make sure reentry programs are funded appropriately to make sure when people come out of prison that they have the opportunity to move in the right track. We also have to invest, as I said earlier, about the right court system. You know, our court system today, 67% of the people going through the system reoffend. Through the wellness programs in the wellness court, 90% do not reoffend. It's putting the investment in the right place. That's what we need to be doing in regards to our correctional issues and dealing with public safety.
All right, thank you, Mr. Begich. It's time now. We're going to take a pause. We've been asking the questions. We're going to let the candidates ask a question of each other. And I believe, Mr. Begich, you are first in this round.
30 seconds.
I want to go back to an issue we talked earlier about, and that's regards to education. And you had asked a question about, do you support vouchers or not? I heard your explanation, Mike. But the question is, religious schools and other types of schools like that, not homeschool, religious schools, are you for a voucher program? As you presented a bill on this, very similar, but are you for that?
So let me clarify. I never presented a bill on a voucher program. It was a constitutional amendment to allow public monies to go to private education, but there was no bill. Okay. This would have clarified what we currently do, as mentioned earlier, because of the Sheldon Jackson case. But am I open to school choice for individuals? Am I open for school choice for families so that they can have the best outcomes possible? Yes, I am.
This is a clear difference between myself and Mike. You know, as I said earlier, public education is a foundation of a great community, a great state, in the sense of growing our economy and making sure every child, no matter who they are, has the opportunity. When you think of rural Alaska, where they have just one school, for example, and you hand them a voucher, where are they going to go? There's no choice out there in the sense of the one school. Public education is the best investment we can make. I'm supportive of public education. I want to put the money in the Constitution to make sure it's protected so we see it in the future for our young people.
And Mr. Dunleavy, quick rebuttal, please.
Just quick rebuttal. Again, Senator Begich sent his child to a private school, number one. Number two, I spent 19 years in rural Alaska helping individuals, children in some of our smallest communities. I am 100% committed to making sure that we have the best public education in this country.
Mr. Dunleavy, your turn. What's your question for Mr. Begich?
Thank you. Mark, Governor Walker dropped out of the race after days of negotiations with you and your campaign. Now he has endorsed you as the best candidate to continue his policies and legacy. What policies are part of Walker's legacy will you continue? Will it be record unemployment, high crime, reduced PFDs, a bloated budget, or all of the above?
Well, first I'll say, you know, Governor Walker did an amazing thing, putting Alaska first, and I give him credit for that. He thought about the future, as you heard his speech that he gave at AFM. Medicaid expansion, I'll continue it because I think it makes a difference for 44,000 Alaskans. I'm going to continue. The pipeline issue is on the 10-yard line of the opponent. We have an opportunity to push that over the line, make sure we have jobs for the future and opportunities. His work that he's done with tribal communities all across this state has engaged tribal communities for the first time in our Alaska government, giving them a voice that they did not have before. Will I continue that? Yes, I will. When he declared a disaster when it comes to our opioid crisis, as we have talked already about crime and what that is doing to our state, you betcha, I'll make sure. But I'll tell you, Mike, you were in the legislature as unemployment went up, when crime went up because of the cuts you did. Education now 46, because you spent the time cutting those budgets, and that's why we are where we are today.
Give
Mr.
it
Dunleavy,
30
Yeah, crime did not go up because of the legislature. Crime went up because of mismanagement over the past 3 to 4 years in the current administration. Management is the key to making sure that we have the focus, we're going to put the focus on public safety as job number one. Not all budgetary items are equal. You cannot compare a fast rail study to having more troopers. Under my administration, and again, the troopers endorsed me, under my administration, public safety will be job one.
Our state has the dubious distinction of having the highest rates in the nation in sexual assault, domestic violence, and suicide. Why do you think Alaska is always at the top of these lists? And as governor, what can you do about it? Mr. Dunleavy.
So I'm a father of 3 daughters. I live in rural Alaska. My wife is from Alaska. I take this issue very seriously. I think as a governor, you once again, you make this a priority, not just in statement, but all the way through your administration. You make sure that we have folks in place that are experts in this area, that we can develop the laws and approaches to make sure that all individuals, women and men, are protected, and that we make sexual assault the #1 issue. We'll make sure that our rape kits, in which we have a backlog of rape kits, for example, are processed quickly. We'll make sure that we have the requisite number of troopers and BPSOs all over the state of Alaska. Making sure that we have the policing that we need, and also making sure that we have the prosecuting attorneys to prosecute these cases is critical to making sure that sexual assault is eliminated in the state of Alaska.
All right, thank you. Mr. Begich?
Well, I think there's several things you can do in regards to sexual assault, suicide, the many issues you brought up. One piece of this puzzle is substance abuse, and making sure we do everything we can to change that dialogue in regards to how we deal with people who have substance abuse issues. But along with that, I was just with a group of young people. Every group I've met with youth brings up the issue of suicide. One of the things that's no longer really available in our school system is making sure we have counselors, not academic counselors, but counselors there to help young people. Also, I believe I've seen young peer groups working together, helping their friends and others understand if they see signs of people that may be in that situation, what they can do to help them. Also, you know, we're now seeing another increase of individuals, young people, being shipped out of state because we don't have enough facilities here to take care of our youth when it comes to mental health issues, substance abuse, and others. We need to put the investment in that makes a difference long term. These are some of the things that I would do.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's talk about resource development now and protecting the environment. Both of you have expressed support for drilling in Anwar. Now, the Gwich'in people are extremely concerned about the potential effect on caribou. How would you address their concerns and at the same time balance development in Anwar with environmental protection? Mr. Begich, you're first.
Well, I would use the same effort I did when I was in the U.S. Senate working on the issue of the Arctic development. You know, at that time, the Obama administration did not support it. There was a lot of challenges with people on the shores and the villages, but we engaged the villages, the whaling captains, the villages, the individual leadership throughout the communities. You have to engage all the stakeholders at the same time, just like we did on MPRA when we sat down with the villages also being impacted. And we also had a lot of issues with a very sensitive lake there and bird habitat. You find a balance, but you bring everyone to the table. This is the biggest thing I think is missing in politics today. It's always this side or that side. Instead of saying, we're going to do this right for Alaska, we're going to sit down together, we're going to figure out this problem, because at the end of the day, we're all here for a reason, because of this great state we live in. But it is sitting down with the different partners and the stakeholders, trying to resolve the issues that are in front of us. I've done it, and I've seen the outcome.
Mr. Dunleavy.
We have some of the most stringent regulations on the planet when it comes to developing our resources. We just continue to apply those regulations properly. We'll reduce the possibility of any type of oil spill or accident on the slope. And so looking at what we've done on the slope over the past 40 years, I think we have a pretty good track record, and I think we rely on those regulations.
All right, thank you. Turning to the long sought after gas line, are you more concerned about the risk the state will take on by taking the lead in building it, Or are you more concerned about the risk it will never be developed at all if the state doesn't take the lead? Mr. Dunleavy.
That's a very good question. And so this question comes up in a lot of the forums and discussions with folks across Alaska. We don't have the access to the confidentiality agreements to really understand where this project is. We don't know how much the gas is going to be sold for at the wellhead by the producers. We're not sure what the contracts are with the agents that are contemplating contracting with AGDC. We don't know what the cost is in between in terms of the infrastructure itself. Until we get in there and take a look at those confidentiality agreements, it's difficult to say if this is a project that will return $1 to Alaska or if this is a project that could be a boondoggle for Alaska. It's crucial to get into those confidentiality agreements before you can really answer this question.
Mr. Begich.
I think on the pipeline, as I said earlier, you know, there is issues that we don't know about, but you got to look at the project. Governor Walker has brought it this far. My belief is we need to continue to push forward. We have to manage it correctly. We need to make sure that we have the markets to ensure that the gas can be sold. But not having all those early dollars, it's hard to figure out what the financial piece is. But I do believe that this is a project. It's been, since I was born, it seems we've been talking about this project. We are on the 10-yard line of the opponent. Let's push it over the goal line. And when we get over the goal line, we'll know if it's fiscally responsible in the sense of what we can do with it. But it has a huge potential to make sure it creates jobs for Alaska, monetize our gas, and make sure we have a project that can go forward.
Gentlemen, thank you. Big picture question. What is Alaska's #1 problem during the next 5 to 10 years? What, as governor, would you do to address it? Mr. Begich.
Well, the first thing we have to do is deal with the budget, as we've talked about. But the #1 issue is crime. There is no question. Matter of fact, on my way here, I almost thought I was going to be late because I ended up stopping a fight in the middle of 13th and Gamble because of an incident that occurred there. So crime is a problem. It doesn't matter where you live, who you are, you're impacted by it. We have to have a strong strategic plan. I put it on my website, begich.com. I'd encourage people to go to it. We got to bring all the commissioners together that deal with health and human services, the law, public safety, corrections, put them together to figure out what we can do to move forward. We need to be tougher with our issues with regards to drug dealers out there, as I mentioned earlier today. But we also have to recognize that this issue does not go away overnight. We have to work double time, because I do not want to have people thinking about if they walk out of their home, is their car still there? Or in our case with our 16-year-old son, what's he out in the streets and what's going on out there? This is, I think, the #1 issue. Along with the budget you have to deal with, but long term, this is how you create a safer community, a better place to invest, and people to stay and retire.
Thank you, Mr. Begich. Mr. Dunleavy.
It's absolutely public safety. I mean, that's the primary purpose of the state, of any government, is to provide safety for its citizens. The last 4 years, we've all changed our behaviors. I don't think there's any of us that know of anyone that has not been impacted by crime, either directly or indirectly. I know, for example, we didn't know where the keys were to our home for 13 years. We would go on vacations without locking the doors. We've changed the locks on our doors. We've taken the keys out of our car. We've had to add an extra dog. We keep the lights on. And when we come into Anchorage or go into Wasilla, we actually decide where we're going to park the car now. It's changed our lives. We've got to get a handle on this. This has to be job #1 for the next governor.
We have a couple of lightning round questions we want to ask, and please keep your responses to 15 seconds or less, and a simple yes or no will do for these. Do you support expanding vote by mail statewide like we do here in Anchorage? And let's go with Mr. Dunleavy first.
Not at this stage of the game. I want to take a look at it and make sure we wring out any of the errors or possible mistakes that can be made in that process.
Mr. Begich, vote by mail statewide. What do you think?
Absolutely. We saw the impact here in Anchorage when the April vote occurred. 80,000 people turned out, record number. And most importantly, some of the most disenfranchised neighborhoods in our city ended up voting more than ever before. This is the right. Make it easier, give people the right to vote, and vote by mail works across this country, the states that are doing it.
Do you believe that voter fraud is a problem that affects election outcomes, Mr. Begich?
On vote by mail or?
Just voter fraud generally.
You know, we've seen very little in our state. We've seen some recently that definitely needs to be looked at, investigated. But I'll tell you, over our time as a state dealing with elections, very minimal at all. So I think we have a great system, and vote by mail has worked many places across this state, across this country.
Mr. Dunleavy, voter fraud a problem?
Yeah, let me go back to something real quick. My family got a ballot in Wasilla to vote in the Anchorage elections. There are bugs in this system that need to be worked out. In terms of fraud, you have an issue here in one of the districts, House districts in Anchorage, that's being looked at and investigated right now. So is there potential for fraud? Of course there is.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. We have come to near the end of our debate. It's time for closing statements. We're going to get 1 minute from each candidate, and we had a second towing cost. Mr. Dunleavy goes first.
Thank you. And to the people of Alaska, thanks for this opportunity tonight. We're getting ready for a change. You're going to have a new governor come November 6th. I'd like to be that governor. I want to make sure that when I am governor, that we look at the issues that we've talked about tonight and not just talk about them, but make sure that we put them into action. Public safety has got to be job number one for the state of Alaska for the next governor. We've got to make this the safest state in the country. Sexual assault, theft, opiates, we've heard the stories, we've read the stories. We've got to get a handle on this situation. As governor, I'll take care of that. We have to make sure we restore trust in the people of Alaska, in their government. Returning the PFD to its former calculation, its full calculation will also be one of the primary things I do as governor. We have to make sure that we have better educational outcomes for Alaskans. You have a choice. You can look at the future, put somebody in there that you trust, somebody that's not a career politician, and we can move Alaska forward together.
Mr. Dunleavy, thank you. Mr. Begich, your 1 minute closing statement.
Well, again, thank you to all the folks viewing and listening to this debate tonight. Hopefully you'll see some differences between someone like myself, who's given very specific ideas of how we move Alaska forward. We have great challenges in education, public safety, making sure we're no longer the number one when it comes to unemployment, but providing opportunities for young people. You know, I travel, as I said earlier, around the state, listening and talking to people. I see the hopes and dreams of individuals, but they're wondering what's their future look like. They see the dream of Alaska slipping away, but I don't. I believe in what's possible. I believe it every single day. I wake up thinking about what we can do to make this state a better place. And I know Alaskans think the same thing as I talk to them. They believe in what's possible. This election is about the future. It's about who will take us to the next 15, 20, 30 years and beyond for the next generation. I would love to be your governor. I'd look forward to your help and support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes this evening's debate for the state for governor. Thank you for tuning in.
Please join us again tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. on Channel 2 and Alaska Public Media for the debate between the U.S. House candidates, Don Young and Elise Galvin. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a good evening.